Welcome back. Our second event of the Hidden in Heritage Festival brings us to the Foundling Hospital in London and takes us back to the late 1700s, where the governors of the hospital have requested a list to be drawn up of the children who, and I quote, by reason of blindness, lameness, or other infirmities, may not be fit to be put to apprentice. A few years ago, the Foundling Museum presented an exhibition inspired by this list entitled So That They May Be Useful to Themselves. Thomas Aird, our next presenter, is a volunteer at the museum, and he worked on this exhibition with a focus on the children at the time who had learning disabilities. Thomas will share some of the key stories and characters who came out in his research. This talk includes historical terminology, which 2020 listeners will find offensive. However, the terms will be used for the purposes of historical accuracy and an acknowledgement of the attitudes and perceptions of the 18th century. Over to Thomas.
Hello, my name is Thomas Aird and I'm a volunteer at the Foundling Museum in Brunswick Square, London. I've been a volunteer at the museum since I retired as a principal lecturer in health and social care at London South Bank University in December 2015. In 2016, the museum ran a volunteer-led project called So That They May Be Useful to Themselves, a title taken directly from hospital committee minutes, and was a project which explored the Foundling Hospital's work with disabled children. The hospital was groundbreaking in its approach to educational, medical, and financial care, in some cases from the cradle to the grave, and the governors wanted to enable the child to achieve their potential, whatever their limitations. The outcome for the project was a display curated by a small group of the museum's volunteers, which, along with a series of case studies, explored how the Foundling Hospital dealt with children and grown-up children with different disabilities in the 18th and 19th centuries. My part in the project focused on a group of children labelled as idiots, which I will be talking about today. By today's standards, the individuals discussed in this paper would most likely be classed as having learning disabilities. So I must make clear now that although the terminology used may be considered offensive and degrading, the paper uses the terminology as recorded at that time within the hospital records. The records for the Foundling Hospital are held in the London Metropolitan Archives, and the collection consists of over 800 linear feet of shelving, an estimated 8 tons of paper, and over 1,000 plans. Data was collected through manual searches of various documents, and the child's Foundling Hospital number, which I will explain shortly, was crucial in the cross-referencing of primary sources. I think it's important to start with a brief overview of the Foundling Hospital to help put what became a serious problem for the governors into context. Foundling is a historic term applied to children, usually babies, that have been abandoned by parents and discovered and cared for by others. Abandoned children were not unusual in the 18th century when the Foundling Hospital was established. The Hospital for the Education and Maintenance of Exposed and Deserted Young Children, to give the hospital its correct title, was Britain's first institution for abandoned children. It was Britain's first children's charity. It was Britain's first public art gallery. It was also the place where Handel's oratorio The Messiah was rescued from obscurity. And it predates its famous nearby neighbour, Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children, by 110 years. The combination of art and philanthropy resulted in the Foundling Hospital becoming a focal gathering point for 18th century polite society. The hospital operated between the years 1739 and 1954, and during that period it took in 27,000 children. The normal path followed by a child after admission to the hospital was that children were received into the hospital when only a few days to months old. The hospital aimed to admit only apparently healthy children, and babies were refused admission if on examination it was felt that they had the French pox, evil, leprosy, or disease of the like nature. Children were sent to the country to foster carers or wet nurses until 4 or 5 years old, and then at that point they were brought back to the hospital and given an education, never to see the foster parent again. In the 18th century, about the age of 10, in the 19th century, about the age of 14, the children were sent out to apprenticeships. The governors would still have responsibility for the child, however, up until the age of 21. In 1926, the hospital moved out of London to temporary accommodation in Red Hill, and then again in 1936, it moved to brand new premises in Berkhamsted and closed as a residential institution in 1954 and continues today as a children's charity forum. On admission, detailed records were kept of the children, and written records include any distinguishing marks or features and any clothes and other objects brought with the child. You may be familiar with the tokens which mothers sometimes left with children in the early days of the hospital. These were put into these children's files, and if the mother came back, the token would form a form of identity if she was claiming the child. These records, or billets as they were known, were then sealed, one for each child. An admittance number, and that's what I called the Foundling Hospital number earlier, that corresponded to the written record was stamped on a lead tag attached to a necklace. This necklace was placed around the child's neck, and staff were forbidden to remove it. At the same time, babies were baptized Anglican and were given a new name before being sent to a wet nurse. The idea of giving a new identity to the child was to afford the mother some anonymity. However, once a baby was renamed, its admission number was the only link to its origins. Between the years 1756 and 1760, the hospital received government grants on the condition that they accept every child brought to the hospital under a predetermined age, for example, 2 months. This period was known as a general admission and is often viewed as a period of indiscriminate admission. It is important to this paper because of the long-term impact it had upon the hospital. During this 4-year period, almost 15,000 children were admitted, and to accommodate this increase in admissions, 6 branch hospitals were opened. The 2 major ones were number 1 at Ackworth in Yorkshire, and secondly in Shrewsbury. No images of the children exist, but this image may give some indication of how they may have appeared. In the final scene of William Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode, the principal female character is dying from an overdose of laudanum. The child being held up to give her mother a final kiss clearly displays signs of disease, bent legs strapped in calipers suggesting rickets, and a black spot in the face indicating congenital syphilis. The second character of note in this scene stands to the right of the group. The manservant being scolded for acquiring the laudanum for his mistress displays the facial expressions of an idiot. William Hogarth was influential in the Foundling Hospital becoming an art gallery, excuse me, and I had wondered if, when I started this project, he had based the servant character on one of the boys included in the study. Alas, the date of the print is too early, 1743. A contemporary definition from MENCAP says that a learning disability is a reduced intellectual ability and difficulty with everyday activities, for example, household tasks, socializing, or managing money, which affects someone for their whole life. As I was reviewing the information that I had gathered, I started to reflect on whether some of the people I was looking at, rather than have a learning disability, may actually have had a learning difficulty. for example, dyslexia or dyspraxia. MENCAP, for example, described dyslexia as a learning difficulty because, unlike learning disability, it does not affect intellect. This is an area that could do with more exploration to actually try and tease out the differences amongst these children. The terms used in the Foundling Hospital records include low capacity, soft, weak understanding, inclining to idiotism, perfect idiot. And it's these descriptors which may help to start differentiate disability from difficulty. In addition, a number of these children also suffer from epileptic seizures. 10 years after the cessation of the general admission, 1770, the governors were faced with a dilemma regards how to deal with a number of children regarded as unfit or unsuitable to be put out to apprentice as they approached the appropriate age. On November 1770, the subcommittee orders that the secretary do lay before the committee an account of those children who, by reason of blindness, lameness, or other infirmities, may not be fit to put out to apprentice, together with their names, numbers, and when taken in. This order refers specifically to the branch hospitals at Ackworth and Shrewsbury, with a separate list presented for London. And these are the lists. And in this column, on the left-hand side, we have the list for Ackworth. And at the top here, we have 19 idiots recorded. We have 3 children who are dumb, and we have 1 child who is fits. Now that gives a grand total of 143 overall children with some form of disability at Ackworth. In Shrewsbury it's only 7, and in London it's 39. In the London records, they're a bit more detailed in that they actually break it down to the individual children, and it includes the number and the date the child was received. We have Simon Barker, and he was admitted on the 19th of September 1759, and his Foundling Hospital number is 13,971. Remember that Simon Barker is the name that he was given in the Foundling Hospital. It is not his birth name. Now, Simon, unfortunately, died at the age of 12 of smallpox. The second child, Anne Fotherby, brought in September 1758 with the number of 9,153, is a slightly different character, and it appears that when she was sent out to the foster parent, she remained with the foster parent. And in 1782, when she's aged 23-24, it's recorded that the governors order her to be returned to the hospital, and on her return, they report that her situation is so far more deplorable than that what it was ever thought to be, that she must have so constant an attendance as not fit to be seen. Therefore, this committee have determined that the said Fotherby shall be sent back to be under the care of Elizabeth Tennant of Redburn, with whom she was before. 4 years later, in 1786, Anne dies at the age of 27. So at Ackworth, we have 19 children listed as idiot, 5 boys and 14 girls. What's interesting in this is only 3 of these 19 children were admitted before the general admission. There follows a number of subcommittee discussions around the disposal of the disabled children, and in July 1771, Dr. Cookston at Ackworth presents his observations of the children. Terms such as grown much better, has become useful, can do something, to the other extreme of not likely to become useful, are used to judge the potential abilities and suitability of these children being sent out to apprentice. It's also in 1771 that there is a suggestion to remove the idiots, that they be not assembled with the other children. And from what I can gather on that, that's to protect the idiot children from taunting by the other children in the hospital. In 1772, children at Ackworth are listed as being employed within the hospital. 5 idiot boys in the coal yard and pump, manufactory and the pig yard. 9 idiot girls are listed as working in the dairy, manufactory and infirmary. As a consequence of this employment, it is suggested by the governors that as many of these children have been employed in manufactory, some person in the trading towns in the neighbourhood of Ackworth, and remember this is Yorkshire, might be induced to take some of them with a moderate premium. This issue is revisited again in 1773, but this time the governors emphasised the importance of finding employment, as this committee apprehends that they may be made useful in some sort to the public and not remain a dead weight to this corporation for their maintenance and support. On May the 1st, 1773, it is recorded that 47 children remain at Ackworth, and an order is given that the 17 boys and 25 girls deemed unfit to be put out to apprentice be returned to London to enable the closure of Ackworth. And in November 1773, it is proposed that children are examined and classed in one of 5 categories. 1, children who are now and always will be incapacitated to do anything. 2, those children who may be in time become capable of doing something. 3, children incurable. 4, ailing children who may be cured. And 5, children who may be disposed of as apprentices with a fee. So this is a list of the 5 boys at Ackworth. And at the top we have Robert Brown, number 281. This is quite a low number, so this indicates that Robert was admitted before the general admission. The other 4 boys came in after that, so that would be after 1756. 2 of the boys, William Fargold and Vernon Noakes, are both being identified by Dr. Cookson as grown much better and can do something. Alongside the issue of disposal of the children outside the hospital, it's now discussed that perhaps an advertisement could be prepared for publication. Now, I've never seen the advert in the newspaper yet, but I haven't really searched for it. But suffice to say, they come up with the conclusion that this committee hereby give notice that they will be ready to treat any proper person or persons who may be willing to take any such children as apprentices or under their care. On May the 4th, 1774, possibly as a result of that advertisement, the governors are approached by the director of the House of Industry in Britannia Street, which is rather close to the Foundling Hospital, offering the opportunity to house some of the boys. Described as for the benefit of parish and other poor boys, a House of Industry is opened in an airy and healthy situation near Islington for boys of 6 years of age, and in our case above, until they are fit to be apprenticed. The governors view this as a positive initiative, stating that sending some of the ailing children into that house might be the means to give them a better turn to industry that they can acquire in this hospital. 10 boys were initially identified to be sent. The boys coloured red in this slide are 4 of the idiot boys. Number 3 in the list, Samuel Adams, is identified as weak in his intellects, so this is clearly another child who has actually been identified as possibly within that idiot category. It's important to look at the ages on this. By this stage, Robert is an adult of 29 years old, and the youngest is 16. The youngest is 12. But the boys are becoming adults. Luke Knowles, number 4, remains at the Foundling Hospital at the request of the apothecary, and he becomes the apothecary's assistant and stays in that role for a number of years. The boys remain at the House of Industry for a year when they're returned to the Foundling Hospital by the order of the governors. The reason for that is not clear, but the subcommittee report that the boys were quite destitute of clothing, Later entries suggest that the House of Industry was still operating in 1779. Two of the boys, plus Samuel Adams, the new name that appeared on the list, were apprenticed. Edward Barnard I'll talk about separately. Vernon Noakes was apprenticed to a peruke maker, which is a wig maker, until 21 years old. And then Samuel Adams actually has three apprentice masters. First one, a gingerbread baker. Second one, a gentleman, so he's to be employed in household business. And the third one he's assigned to, I couldn't find out what the occupation actually was, but I suspect it was probably household business. What happened to Samuel after that, I've got no idea. Two of the boys, Edmund Hart and William Fargold, the records suggest they did not complete an apprenticeship, but rather when they reached the age of 21, they were actually hired out, becoming of age. But as yet, I've been unable to find out any additional information on the boys. Now, one of the case studies, Robert Brown. Robert, as we said, number 281, idiot subject to epileptic fits, admitted in 1746. In 1747, he developed measles, and whether this had an impact on his brain development, which resulted in his learning disability and possible fits, I don't know. I can only speculate on that. He returns to London in 1750, and then he's sent to Ackworth. And then in 1773, with the other children, he returns to London. But he's creating a problem for the governors because he is an adult by this stage. And the governors report that Robert Brown is an idiot and that it will be necessary until such time as judgment can be formed what use he can be put to, that be kept separate from the other children. And they order that the steward do see that the baker who now lays in the bakehouse have a bed put up in the garret where other bakers have laid, and another for Brown, and that the baker do make him get up and go to bed at the same hours with him, and endeavour, if possible, to make him by some sort of labour useful. Unfortunately, Robert is sent to the House of Industry in 1776, and within about 4 or 5 months of going to the House of Industry, he unfortunately dies at the age of 30. No cause of death is listed, and he is buried in St Pancras Churchyard, as a lot of the foundling children are. Now, we can perhaps speculate that possibly the cause of death might be an epileptic fit, and in a House of Industry, which is actually weaving cloth, having a fit in that kind of situation does not bear imagination. Edward Barnard, slightly different. He's described as low capacity. He goes to Ackworth, comes back to London, sent to the House of Industry, and then in 1778 is apprenticed out to a mariner in the county of Durham. Now, he's to be employed in sea service, but in 1779 he's discharged from His Majesty's service as unfit by order of Vice Admiral Rodham. Now, what is interesting is that the master of the House of Industry approached the Foundling Hospital requesting money for Edward's keep. So it appears that Edward made his way back to London, and rather going to the Foundling Hospital, went to the House of Industry. But the governors respond that as Barnard is upward of 21, the governors of this hospital have nothing to do with him, but that he must work for his bread and not depend on being maintained at the charge of this corporation. They also suggest that inquiries be made for a settlement to be made in the parish in which he lived in South Shields. The governors are contacted again in 1780 by the director of the House of Industry, setting forth that Barnard was almost naked for want of clothes, and it is agreed that the hospital will provide clothes at a cost of £1.15 and 6p. And to date, again, I don't know the final outcome of Edward. In terms of the girls, and again, the list of boys, that's simply at the top of this page, simply because that is what the document stated. But Here we have the girls, Nancy Miller and Anne Valley, both coming in before the general admission. And we have two girls here listed with epileptic fits, and with one girl who's listed as dumb. Two of these girls ultimately die quite young. Rebecca Lobb dies age 15, no causes listed, and Rebecca Lane dies age 16, possibly of fits. Three of the girls are apprenticed out. Sarah Edmonds is sent up to Lancaster to be employed in household business. Sarah Chauncey sent to Essex to an embroiderer. She's also sent to another one in Middlesex, also an embroiderer, to serve the remainder of her time. And then Leonora Price is sent to Vauxhall to a timbre or drum maker. Four of the girls are actually listed as in employment of the hospital: Nancy Miller and Anne Valley, and Mary Bingley was listed as working in the laundry, and Dorothy Touch was listed as working in the kitchen. But they are listed also in this report from Matron, looking at children who are actually unfit to do anything, or considered unfit to do anything. Cicely Sparks is an interesting character. Ruth McClure, in her book Corum's Children, records that in 1790, Cicely Sparks was seduced by several of the apprentice boys and was believed to be pregnant. As of yet, I have not found any information in the Governor's record to corroborate this, but again, that is an ongoing investigation. Drusilla Bruce is listed as incapable of doing anything, and she dies at the age of 37. Rebecca Baker, again incapable of doing anything, dies at the age of 69. And Ruth Colby dies suddenly, aged 29. Now, all these women would actually be housed somewhere in the hospital itself. The Anne Valley case study in climbing to idiotism and has become useful. Similar to the boys, returned to London from the wet nurse, went to Ackworth, returned again in 1773, and in 1775, aged 23, she's listed as working in the laundry. In 1779, she's listed as not capable of getting the living out of the hospital, but she's described as being a good girl, very slow, is of service in the laundry, and it's to be recognised that they are to have £3 each yearly. In 1834, Anne is still listed as receiving allowance from the governors, and in 1835, she dies aged 83, and she likewise is buried in St Pancras Churchyard. Judith Wardley I've included in this presentation. Judith isn't listed within the idiot cohort, but she does have very short-sightedness. Now, her initial history in the hospital is straightforward, and she's apprenticed out to a tailor. Unfortunately, within a year, she is reassigned to Sarah Story, who is a laundress, but in 1777, she's returned to the hospital by reason of her very short-sightedness. From that point on, Judith becomes problematic. She is repeatedly admonished by the governors for being a bad girl, for being very obstinate, slothful, minding nothing that is said to her, for theft and for assault. And reading through the lines, her profile to me suggests that she has what we would consider challenging behaviour today. Challenging behaviour is not a learning disability, but it's possible that she may have some other condition. She may have something like Asperger's. This must be compounded by her visual disturbance as well. So her communication and expressing frustration. However, it basically ends up reaching a peak, and in 1782, at the age of 27, the treasurer was desired to have her locked up in bread and water, that she should have a straight waistcoat put on, and moreover severely flogged. This had been building up. She had been warned and warned. She had been threatened with being put into St Luke's Asylum. What happened to Judith after this, I haven't been able to find out. Unfortunately, the records after the final one that I saw in 782 are not fit to be seen at the moment, so it's not possible to follow up to see if she pops up again. One of my co-volunteers believes she might have found her living in a workhouse somewhere in London, but again, that is something I need to follow up further. So in conclusion, there is a lot of work that still needs to be done to follow these children up. Things like parish records may disclose further information. We don't have census information at this point, so that is not a source to follow. Poorhouse records may throw up additional information as well. So there are a number of wider sources that could possibly be accessed to follow these children up. I would like to suggest, however, that the Foundling Hospital followed the general standards of the time, whereby disabled people generally lived in their own homes and communities. This, of course, would start to change in the 19th century. I would also like to suggest that the hospital governors demonstrated a paternalistic attitude towards the girls in their care, less so towards the boys, possibly because it was much, much easier to find an apprenticeship for the boys. I would like to thank the museum for making it possible for me to carry out this research, and secondly to the organisers of this conference for allowing me to share it with you. I hope you find the presentation interesting. I hope you found it stimulating, and I hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks for joining me, and many thanks for watching it.